Mercy Whitlock stirred dirt into her family's evening stew while her parents watched in horror from across their small Mississippi cabin. But here's what they didn't know. That same dirt had been whispering to her for 3 weeks, promising to end their suffering forever. What happened next in 1873 would make neighbors abandon their homes and preachers refuse to step foot on Whitlock land for the next 50 years. This is the true story behind the girl who fed her family dirt, and why some say she's still cooking in those woods today. The summer of 1873 was the kind that broke people. Mississippi cotton fields withered under a sun that seemed angry at the world. The heat came in waves that made the air shimmer like water, and the ground cracked open like wounds that refused to heal. Rivers dried to muddy trickles. Wells ran empty. And even the strongest men began to question if God had abandoned them entirely. The Whitlock family, Pa Samuel, Ma Ruth, and their 3 children, had already buried their youngest that spring when the fever took him. Little Benjamin, barely 2 years old, had wasted away in his mother's arms while she sang lullabies that turned to sobs. Now they watched their crops die while their stomachs ate themselves from the inside, each day bringing them closer to joining Benjamin in the small family cemetery behind their cabin. Samuel Whitlock had been a proud man once. He'd cleared this land with his own hands, built their cabin log by log, and raised cotton that made other farmers envious. But pride doesn't fill empty bellies, and watching his family slowly starve stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself. His clothes hung loose on his shrinking frame, and his hands shook when he tried to work their failing fields. Ruth Whitlock spent her days staring at empty pantry shelves, calculating how many more meals they could stretch from their dwindling supplies. She'd already watered down their soup until it was barely more than flavored water. She'd ground corn cobs into their cornmeal and boiled leather scraps to make broth. But mathematics was cruel. No matter how she divided their remaining food, they had maybe a week left. Mercy Whitlock was 15, old enough to understand death, but young enough to believe she could fight it. She watched her father grow thinner each day, watched her mother's eyes sink deeper into her skull like stones settling into mud. Her baby brother Thomas, now the youngest after Benjamin's death, cried constantly from hunger until he no longer had the strength to cry at all. He just lay in his wooden cradle, staring at the ceiling with eyes too big for his tiny face. But Mercy had always been different from other girls in their settlement. She could predict storms days before they arrived, reading the signs in the way leaves turned their backs to the wind and how birds fell silent in the trees. She knew when someone was going to die by the way shadows fell across their face, creating patterns that spoke of endings yet to come. The local preacher, Reverend Hawkins, called it the devil's touch, but Ma Ruth said it was just the gift some folks carried, a blessing and a curse rolled into one. Either way, Mercy learned early to keep her mouth shut about the things she saw and heard. People in small Mississippi settlements didn't take kindly to girls who claimed to see the future, especially when those predictions had an uncomfortable way of coming true. That's when the dirt started calling to her. It began as a whisper she heard while drawing water from their well, a sound so faint she almost dismissed it as wind through the pines. But the voice seemed to come from deep underground, like words carried up through layers of earth and time, through the bones of the dead and the roots of ancient trees. At first, Mercy thought it was her imagination playing tricks on a hungry mind. Starvation could make a person hear all sorts of things that weren't there. But the whispers grew stronger each night, more insistent, more real. They came when she was alone, when the rest of her family had fallen into the fitful sleep of the starving. The voice would seep up through the floorboards of their cabin, through the cracks in the walls, through the very air she breathed. "Feed them," the voices said in a tone like rustling leaves and shifting soil. "Feed them what grows in the dark places. Feed them what the earth offers freely to those brave enough to accept its gifts." The voices spoke of hunger that went deeper than empty bellies, of needs that regular food could never satisfy. They promised solutions to problems that seemed impossible to solve, offered hope when hope had become as scarce as rain in their withered fields. They told her about special dirt, earth that was different from the ordinary soil that covered their failing farm. The dirt they talked about wasn't ordinary soil. Mercy found it in a ring of dead trees about a quarter-mile from their cabin, in a place where nothing had grown for as long as anyone could remember. The earth there was black as coal and felt warm even on cold mornings. When she dug into it with her bare hands, it moved like it was alive, pulsing with its own rhythm like a slow heartbeat buried deep in the ground. Local folks had stories about that circle of dead trees, stories that parents used to frighten children into good behavior. They said it was where the Cherokee used to bury their cursed dead, back before the government forced them west on what would later be called the Trail of Tears. The bodies buried there weren't just any Cherokee, according to the tales. They were the ones who had turned to dark magic in their desperation, the medicine men who had made deals with spirits better left undisturbed. Others claimed it was where a witch had been burned during the early days of white settlement. The story went that she had cursed the ground with her dying breath, promising that anyone who disturbed her rest would join her in whatever torment awaited beyond death. The trees had died shortly after her execution, their branches turning black and brittle as bone. But Mercy didn't care about old stories and ancient warnings. All she cared about was the promise the voices made, that the dirt from that cursed place would end her family's suffering forever. When you're watching the people you love waste away before your eyes, you'll consider options that would horrify you in better times. The first night she brought it home, hidden in her apron pockets, Mercy waited until everyone was asleep. She crept to their meager food stores and mixed small amounts of the black soil into their cornmeal, their last precious handful of beans. Even the thin broth Ma Ruth made from boiling bones they'd already picked clean 3 times. The effect was immediate and miraculous. The next morning, her family woke with more energy than they'd had in months. Pa Samuel's persistent cough, the one that had been getting worse each week, disappeared completely. Ma Ruth's hands stopped shaking from weakness, and she moved around their kitchen with something approaching her old vigor. Baby Thomas laughed for the first time since the fever took his twin brother, a sound so sweet and unexpected that it brought tears to everyone's eyes. They ate every scrap of food Mercy prepared that morning, praising how good everything tasted despite their dire circumstances. The cornmeal porridge, usually bland and watery, now had a rich, earthy flavor that satisfied them in ways regular food never had. Even their meager portions seemed to fill them completely, leaving everyone satisfied and content. But the voices weren't satisfied with small amounts. Each night, as Mercy lay in bed listening to her family's peaceful breathing, the whispers returned with new demands. "They're still hungry," the voices told her in tones that rustled like wind through grave dirt. "The surface hunger is gone, but the deeper hunger remains. Feed them more. Feed them properly." Mercy began increasing the portions of dirt in their meals, mixing it more boldly into their daily bread and evening stews. A handful in the morning porridge became 2 handfuls. A sprinkle in their water became a generous scoop. Her family grew stronger and stronger with each passing day, but they also began to change in ways that made her stomach twist with worry. Pa Samuel's eyes were the first thing to change. They shifted from their natural brown to the color of rich soil after rain, dark and deep, and somehow too knowing. He began sleeping with his hands pressed flat against the cabin floor, as if trying to feel something moving far beneath the wooden planks. When he worked in their garden, he would sometimes stand motionless for minutes at a time, his head cocked like he was listening to voices only he could hear. Ma Ruth started sleeping with her hands buried in the garden dirt, even though nothing grew there anymore. She would dig small holes beside their cabin each night and thrust her fingers deep into the earth, sighing with contentment as if the soil was giving her something she desperately needed. During the day, she would catch herself eating handfuls of dirt from their property, claiming it tasted better than any food she'd ever consumed. Baby Thomas's changes were the most disturbing of all. He began eating dirt directly from the floor, crawling around their cabin and stuffing handfuls of soil into his mouth while giggling with delight. His laughter had taken on a different quality too, deeper, more resonant, like the sound was coming from somewhere much larger than his tiny body. When he looked at Mercy, his infant eyes held an intelligence that no baby should possess. If you're enjoying this story of supernatural horror and family desperation, Make sure to subscribe to our channel. We explore the darkest corners of American folklore every week, digging up tales that will haunt your dreams and make you question what's really buried in the ground beneath your feet. The changes weren't just physical. Her family members started speaking in unison sometimes, finishing each other's sentences in voices that didn't quite sound like their own. When one of them would begin to say something, the others would nod along as if they already knew exactly what words were coming. They moved differently too, like they were all connected by invisible strings. When one of them turned their head to look at something, the others would turn theirs the exact same way at the exact same moment. Mercy wanted to stop adding the dirt to their food, but the voices had grown too loud and insistent to ignore. They filled her dreams with visions of her family wasting away to nothing, of burying Thomas next to his twin brother Benjamin, of watching Ma Ruth die in her sleep from hunger while Pa Samuel followed soon after. The cursed dirt promised these horrors would never come to pass as long as she kept feeding it to them. But the voices also began making new promises, stranger ones that made Mercy's skin crawl even as they fascinated her. They spoke of her family becoming something greater than human, something that could never die or suffer or want for anything ever again. The neighbors began to notice something was wrong when the Whitlock family stopped coming to town for their weekly supplies. Samuel had been making the trip to the general store every Saturday for years, but now weeks passed without any sign of the family. Mrs. Henderson, who lived closest to the Whitlock property, was the first to report seeing strange behavior. She claimed to have witnessed all 4 family members standing motionless in their yard at midnight, arranged in a perfect circle and staring up at the moon with their mouths hanging open. They remained like that for over an hour, never moving or speaking, just breathing in unison while something dark seemed to flow between them in the moonlight. The postmaster, Jacob Mills, had his own disturbing encounter when Samuel finally did venture into town after a month's absence. The man who had always been polite and soft-spoken tried to pay for supplies with handfuls of black dirt, insisting it was more valuable than gold or silver. When Mills refused the soil as payment, Samuel became agitated in ways that seemed completely unlike his usual demeanor. Other townspeople reported similar strange encounters. The blacksmith claimed Samuel had tried to eat horseshoe nails, insisting they tasted like the finest candy. The preacher's wife said Ma Ruth had approached her after church services, speaking in a language that sounded almost like English, but with words arranged in patterns that made no sense. Then came the night when everything changed forever, when Mercy's desperate attempt to save her family reached its inevitable conclusion. She was preparing their evening meal when she made a horrifying discovery. They had run out of regular food entirely. Every container in their pantry now held only the black dirt from the cursed ground, stored in pots and jars throughout their cabin like some macabre collection. The transformation had been so gradual that she hadn't noticed how completely the supernatural soil had replaced their normal supplies. Her family sat around their wooden table, watching her with eager eyes that reflected no light despite the oil lamp burning between them. Their faces had taken on a waxy quality, like candles that had been heated and reshaped by invisible hands. Their skin had developed a grayish tint that reminded Mercy of rich cemetery earth. "What are you cooking tonight, sister?" Thomas asked, though his voice sounded like 3 people talking at once, a baby's gurgle overlaid with an adult man's bass tone, and something else entirely that seemed to come from deep underground. "Something special," Ma Ruth added, her words echoing strangely in the small room as if spoken in a vast cavern rather than their modest cabin. "Something that will satisfy the deepest hunger." But Samuel just smiled, and Mercy saw that his teeth had turned the color of charcoal, black and gleaming in the lamplight like polished stones. When he opened his mouth, she caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness beyond his teeth, something that definitely didn't belong in any human throat. That's when she understood the truth with the clarity of absolute terror. The dirt hadn't been saving her family from hunger. It had been preparing them for something else entirely, something that had been waiting in that cursed ground for decades, maybe centuries, for the right family desperate enough to invite it in. The voices weren't coming from the dirt at all. They were coming from the things living in it, entities that had once been people long ago, before they made the same choice Mercy had made. before they fed their family's earth that changed them into something that was no longer quite human, something that existed in the spaces between life and death. The Cherokee stories had been true after all. The cursed ground was where the desperate dead gathered to whisper lies to the living, where ancient hungers waited patiently for new hosts to sustain their endless existence. Mercy tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her commands. She looked down and saw her feet sinking into the cabin floor as if the wooden planks had turned to quicksand. The boards rippled like water around her ankles, then her knees, pulling her down toward whatever waited beneath their home. Her family watched with those dark, empty eyes as the floor swallowed her piece by piece. They didn't try to help because they couldn't try to help. They were no longer the people she had tried to save. They were something else now, something that served the hungry darkness buried in the cursed ground. "Don't worry, daughter," Pa Samuel said in that voice that belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had been dead for a very long time. "Soon you'll understand. Soon you'll be hungry like us." The last thing Mercy saw before the earthen floor claimed her completely was her family sitting down to their final meal as humans. They ate handful after handful of the black dirt with obvious relish and satisfaction, their faces peaceful and content while something ancient and patient settled into their bones and made itself permanently at home. Local authorities found the Whitlock cabin 3 days later when Mrs. Henderson finally worked up the courage to check on her neighbors. Sheriff Williams and his deputy approached the property with growing unease, noting how the very air around the cabin seemed thick and oppressive. The cabin was empty except for 4 chairs arranged around a table covered in rich black soil that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The floorboards showed signs of recent digging, with several holes that descended far deeper than the foundation should have allowed. But despite clear evidence of excavation, nothing was buried beneath the cabin floor. The family was never seen again, at least not in any form that could be recognized as human. But neighbors reported increasingly strange occurrences in the months and years that followed. Travelers passing through on dark nights claimed to see lights flickering in the abandoned cabin windows, accompanied by sounds of conversation and laughter that seemed to come from underground rather than inside the building. Children from the settlement would dare each other to approach the Whitlock property, only to run screaming when they heard the unmistakable sounds of cooking coming from the empty kitchen, pots and pans clanging, something sizzling in a skillet, and underneath it all, the sound of someone stirring thick liquid with a wooden spoon. The circle of dead trees where Mercy first found the cursed dirt began to expand year after year, killing everything it touched in an ever-widening ring of desolation. The blackened earth spread outward like an infection, turning healthy soil into the same dark, pulsing substance that had transformed the Whitlock family. Local folks learned to avoid that part of the woods entirely, especially after sunset when the whispers grew strongest and most persuasive. But the voices weren't content to stay contained within their original boundaries. They began reaching out to other struggling families, offering the same false promises that had doomed the Whitlocks. During the harsh winter of 1874, the Peterson family lost 2 children to pneumonia and found themselves facing the same desperate choices that had driven Mercy to make her fatal decision. Mrs. Peterson reported hearing voices in her dreams, voices that spoke of special earth that could heal the sick and feed the hungry. The Peterson family vanished during a blizzard in February, leaving behind only an empty farmhouse and more of that dark, fertile soil scattered throughout their property. The pattern repeated itself every few years. A family would face impossible hardships. Someone would start hearing the voices, and eventually the cursed ground would claim new victims. Some say if you visit that spot on nights when the moon is dark and the air is still, you can hear all of them. Not just Mercy stirring something in a pot that exists between worlds, but entire families going through the motions of lives they can never truly live again. The voices have grown stronger over the decades, fed by each new tragedy, each family that believed salvation could grow in ground that had been poisoned by ancient desperation. They're not trying to save anyone anymore. They're recruiting, gathering souls to add to their underground congregation of the eternally hungry. The abandoned Whitlock property was eventually sold to the county for unpaid taxes, but no one ever built on it again. Every attempt to develop the land met with inexplicable failures and accidents. Surveyors would find their equipment malfunctioning for no reason they could determine. Construction crews would discover that their tools became brittle and broke whenever they tried to work on the property. Local historians tried to research the area's past, searching for clues about what might have caused such persistent supernatural activity. They found records of similar incidents stretching back to the earliest days of white settlement. Families disappearing without explanation. Reports of people eating dirt and changing into something else, always centered around that same circle of dead trees. The Cherokee who once lived on that land had their own detailed oral histories about the cursed ground. According to tribal records discovered decades later, they considered it a place where the boundary between life and death had been permanently damaged by ancient rituals performed by desperate medicine men during a time of great famine. Their word for the location translated roughly to the place where earth dreams of flesh. But by 1873, those warnings had been forgotten along with the people who gave them. All that remained was the hunger in the ground and the voices of the dead, waiting patiently for new families desperate enough to ignore the obvious dangers. Mercy Whitlock learned too late that some hungers can never be satisfied, only passed on to others foolish enough to believe they can feed them. The dirt that promised to save her family didn't make them stronger. It made them into something that could never die, but could never truly live either. The circle of dead trees still stands in those Mississippi woods, larger now than it was in 1873 and still expanding with each passing season. Modern developers who acquire property in the area quickly learn to avoid that particular section of land, claiming that soil tests consistently show unusual mineral content that makes construction impossible. But the old-timers in the region know better. They know what's really buried there, what continues to wait patiently beneath that warm, dark soil for the next family desperate enough to believe that dirt can solve what food cannot. And on nights when the wind is just right, when the air is still and the moon is dark, some say you can still smell something cooking in those empty woods. Something that smells like earth and rain and ancient hunger, like promises that should never be trusted and meals that should never be.